So we're going to spend the next 20 minutes talking about diversity beyond gender, which, as you can imagine, is a very rich, very complex, and very multidimensional topic, and includes everything that you know about and probably everything that you haven't talked about. And despite the great strides that we've all made as individuals, within business, and even within governments, it's a topic that continues to confound us. So let's see what we can do in the next 20 minutes. So Paul, I'm not going to call you Dr. Achleitner, is that okay? Yeah. Though you're used to Indian accents.
Sounds
you're
very
used
good.
to Indian
Thank
accents,
you.
aren't
Thank
you? Maybe some context setting. You've been a very respected and active citizen of the corporate globe for not too many decades, but a few decades. You've clearly tussled with this issue, with this question around diversity. How has our definition of diversity evolved, in the various economic cycles and the various companies and the various sectors? Are we really back at the same position we always were? Or is this something that is really much more of an imperative today, given the economic uncertainty and, frankly, political uncertainty we all face?
Well, first of all, I think we got to take a step back. Is diversity different, the debate that we have today, different than it was, say, I don't care, 50 years ago? Yes, of course. I mean, let's just think for a second. 50 years ago, Martin Luther King gave his speech about the dream. 50 years ago, no woman, which I just learned, had ever officially run the Boston Marathon. It was actually illegal, considered to be illegal to be running the Boston Marathon. It would take another 15 to 20 years before Deng Xiaoping actually started his reforms in China. It would take another 30 years before the apartheid regimes came down, okay? And we're not even going to talk about voting in certain provinces of Switzerland for women and so on and so forth, which, frankly, as a student, okay, we went there. I was a student in Switzerland, and we went there to watch the process when these men were gathering, okay, in the middle of the village, proving by their dagger that they had served in the army and therefore having the right to raise their hand, and that's how voting actually occurred. And the vote about not allowing women to vote was a pretty unanimous affair, I can tell you that, watching that going on. So, today, of course, we live in a totally different world, because the different world is driven by, de facto, three topics that have been raised already this morning. It's globalization, it's digitalization, and of course, demographics. I mean, digitalization, as we know, anything that can't be digitalized will be digitalized. Look right here, greetings from the up armband. So the fact is, this allows totally new behavior patterns. Work travels, as we have learned before and heard. Work can be done wherever it is done best or cheapest. It means that you suddenly actually have interactions with virtual teams and colleagues that you would probably never have gotten into contact with before. And suddenly, it's not a bad thing. As a matter of fact, it's a very important thing, because your own professional success depends on it. So is that critical, and does that change the way people think about diversity? Of course. But there is another element that I think we shouldn't lose, and digitalization, of course, this is the right venue to talk about it, has a tremendous impact on the dissemination of information. It's how we receive information, how we ask for information. But what that does is, it takes away information advantages. So, for example, all this information arbitrage, the male network, in some club that, knew all the important stuff, or the, the much more important macro observations of people, I don't care, living in Africa being deprived of certain economic or political freedoms, suddenly being totally in the loop about what's possible in other places in the world, and the impact that that has, and on mobility and fluctuation, buzzword globalization, I think has a tremendous impact on what we consider to be diversity and diversity debate.
So is diversity, then, are you saying, is it less about inclusion, and is it more around talent? So if you're really thinking about it from a business perspective, how much of this is about the war on talent that we all face every single day in our lives? How much is it about building an inclusive culture that really brings perspectives that you just would not have thought about before and hence ends up in a better outcome?
Well, let me actually, again, take a step back. I think we are de facto talking about something that is as old as mankind, and that is the debate between meritocracy, or the struggle, if you want to, between meritocracy and what I would call gene bias. I don't want to call it gender bias because it's more than that, okay? It's the question of, are you there because of your genes, or are you outside because of your genes? Or are you there because of meritocracy, of the things that you have achieved? And that goes from tribalism to feudalism to anything else that you want. And, you know, in many ways, yes, it is about the war of talent, but it is also about the way a modern society, our modern societies, Western modern societies, have started to think about what's right. So it's not only about doing the best things, the most efficient things. It's also, you know, any company that wants to be successful needs to be in tune with its environment, the political environment, the societal environment. And, you know, diversity is something that, inclusion is something that people want. And it ranges far beyond gender. You know, it ranges to handicapped people, you know, obviously all the issue about race, sexual persuasion, and so on and so forth. And in today's environment, if you want to be successful, you have to be attuned to that change.
And so let's get stuck on the gender bit just for a little bit. And maybe we can use Deutsche Bank as an example. I think you have made great strides as you talk about globalization. I think it's 172 different nationalities, 70 plus countries, or 140 nationalities in 70 plus countries. So you are plural, you're international, you are, by definition, you're effortlessly diverse. From a gender perspective, how do you rate your scorecard, and why is it more difficult? I think you have some very impressive programs, mentorship programs, you have dedicated conferences, you have organizations, you have a stated objective to get to, I believe, 25% of women at a senior level. I don't know what the number is today. Is it mid-teens, which 18. Is also very impressive. But why is it so difficult to get executive women at the sort of senior to middle management? Is this something that is just pushing a rock uphill, in that it takes a generation and things will change, and we're trying to create something that's too unnatural?
Well, let's, of course, I have an uphill battle here given the picture that we all saw. A picture which is true, but as they say in accounting, true but not fair. Because we actually could have also shown you a picture of the supervisory board that has 35% women. And by the way, not a single one of them would ever be considered to be a quota woman, if I may use that, okay? Every single person is there because of her competence, her experience, and are viewed that way and respected that way. We could talk about as you rightfully said, 18% that we have on the director and managing director level. The 30%...
Which I will add is very good.
Which we think is not good enough, because we want to aim to go to 25. That's the official stated goal. So we're pushing on that, but we're improving. But I think it's something very important here that we need to, and maybe we can discuss this later, it's the question of the vertical process, okay, vis-a-vis just simply doing something where horizontally this looks right. And I was fascinated to hear the emphasis on results rather than process, because of course, and I never thought I would be sitting here saying that, but of course in my new role as a chairman of a large financial institution, I have learned it's all about process, to get the processes right and not just the results, because I don't think society would accept that we just have the right result, okay? But they didn't feel good about the process of how we got there. And I think that's something we also need to take into account here when we try to achieve the right result.
And just to talk about process, I want to cite a statistic that I personally find fascinating. There was a Heidrick and Struggles Board of Directors survey done in 2012, in which the respondents were asked whether gender played a role in their appointment. You know, you made the point about the Deutsche Bank supervisory board where every woman is there because of her talent and it's real meritocracy. But in that survey, 32% of the women said that their appointment was related to the fact that they were a woman. By the way, 2% of the men said that. I have no idea what they were thinking when those 2% responded, but in any event. The question I have is this notion of self-doubt, this notion where women attribute their success for reasons other than success themselves. They blame or they attribute it to luck. They talk about the imposter theory. If you've talked about Sheryl Sanders' book about leaning in, what can we do about that? What can we do to correct the self-doubt that quickly becomes self-fulfilling if you don't get the processes right to really engage these women very early on in their careers? Otherwise, it does become systematic. How do you actually correct from that, from a process perspective or from a leadership perspective?
Well, first of all, I would not correct, let's not forget, we talk about a survey, you talk about a survey that was done about board of directors, okay? And I would not think that the women that said it had something to do with gender lack self-confidence. I think they are...
Not at all.
They are seriously realistic, okay? And let me explain to you what happens here. We talked a little bit about vertical versus horizontal. Vertical means that you actually have people, let's stick with women, who grow up in the organization or make their way from an early stage in their career up into the organization. They can change their career tracks in between, but they actually groom and make their way up. This is the tough, painful process because there are certain things that you can do as a company to advance that. But there are other things that actually are much broader in terms of infrastructure. All you have to think about, school-age kids and everything else. And certain societies are better in dealing with that, okay, than others. It's clear that in France you have a different kind of setup than you have in Germany, where kids come home at 2 o'clock, expect to be taught properly, whatever the hell that means, okay, by their family members. So you have a much tougher thing here. The one level where you can actually, quote unquote, easily show result. Yeah. Because everybody comes from outside, because everybody is hired into a lateral position, is the board level.
Exactly.
Okay? Because the board of directors with outside directors, per definition, they all come from the outside. So therefore, is that an easy temptation, okay, to go and say, look, I told you so, I'm good, I can do it? The answer is yes. And I would argue that's not even so bad, because if you are on a board of directors, you know, the way you exercise power and control in the organization is through questioning. So I call it führen bei Fragen, or if you want to, leadership by asking the right kind of questions. And because the board of directors, okay, can't just say do this or that, or in certain circumstances they can, but as a rule, they cannot. Okay? But what they need to do is ask the pertinent questions, which then gets the management okay, to shape up and actually say, geez, I don't know how to answer that one. Let's get going and doing this and that. So I would argue, and I hate stereotyping, but if I were to be in the stereotyping business, I would say that as a rule, women tend to be better to ask pertinent questions. Okay? They don't accept as easily the superficial answer. They actually insist, and they want to understand, and they want to question that. And I think that is a very good attribute for a board, in the sense of a supervisory board, controlling board, inside a governance structure of a company to actually have and have more of.
So it's setting an example by asking the right questions. And I think there's a lot of research that suggests that the more diverse the board itself, the more diverse the company. But back to this vertical, I'm fascinated by this vertical. It's tough, it takes time. You've been at it, you've seen it through different cycles. What works? And what has been the biggest surprise for you as you've tried to learn about diversity and about what a tough challenge it is and how to solve for it across all these various organizations?
Well, my biggest surprise, to be honest, is how much debate it still requires. and how much stereotyping is still going on and how much prejudice still exists. And it's actually interesting because on the one hand, the digitalization world that we talk about and that we all hear about is something that actually allows for much better granular information and should actually allow for much better judgment on individual situations. Having said that, one of the biggest challenges of the digital age is the amount of data that you're being flooded with, okay? And the question or the form of how people turn data into information, i.e. something that they can do something with, because you can't do anything with data, you need to interpret it, is frankly, we saw it before, is branding, okay? Because people say, it's Apple, I understand, it's Deutsche Bank, I understand, whatever it is, okay? So through this massive amount of data, you suddenly jump onto a certain brand. Now, in the same fashion though, the other side of the coin is stereotyping. Because given the fact that you actually have this flood of information, people no longer go through all the information that is available, but they go to the one that's quote unquote pre-selected. And the pre-selection algorithm by itself means certain stereotypes. And that, I think, is something we need to think through much more carefully because, you know, let's use a simple example out of the non-digital world, television, okay? Used to be that there were like 3 network televisions in the US, and you know, you kind of like had a preference for one of the 3 maybe, but you were jumping between the 2 or 3, and therefore you actually got a broad perspective of news. Today, if you are a conservative individual, you're on to 1 or 2 channels, who, by the way, reinforce all the notions because they cater to all the prejudices, or not, I don't say this judgmentally, all the stereotypes that they associate with their viewer group. So these behavior patterns get reinforced. And I think one of the issues that I find dangerous and we need to deal with is how to actually avoid that in a modern world, we actually get more into stereotyping rather than less, which is the opportunity that we should have.
That's fascinating. A deluge of information means you self-select. And how do you overlay the fact that we all operate in different sectors on what you just said? So companies that sell to consumers globally, that represent consumers, maybe by definition, are more diverse. I'm talking fashion, I'm talking consumer goods, even in technology, which I come from. It's really been a paucity of women leaders at top. I mean, I think generally there's 9% of women CEOs today. It hasn't really improved much. Technology is not so advanced either. However, as we've seen mobility, utility, and consumer innovations, more and more women who come from a background in design, consumer goods, are actually getting into senior positions. Are we somewhat limited by the sectors in which we operate, despite fundamental shifts happening? Is finance and banking always going to be a certain way, despite some of the advancements that you've just talked about?
Well, I think the key to that, frankly, is customer focus, customer orientation, client orientation, whatever you want to call it, okay? The more that an organization is truly focused on its clients, the more, given the world that we live in, it will, by definition, have to be much more attuned and therefore much more diverse to deal with it. Now, let's all be a little careful, okay? Because everybody is convinced that client orientation is a no-brainer. Everybody says, well, you know, what kind of an organization is it if it's not client-oriented? Henry Ford famously said, if I would have asked my customers, they would have said faster horses. Okay? And of course, anybody who read the biography of Steve Jobs knows that he didn't exactly think very highly of customers. I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but all I'm saying is that it's not a no-brainer that every organization automatically turns into a customer-oriented type of organization. It does just about anything the customers want of them. We have more abilities to do that in a modern world. Mm-hmm. And as we turn more to that ability and to that flexibility, we will, by definition, have to be more diverse internally so that we actually get the messages, the receptivity, and we can actually turn it around and be effective and successful.
Couldn't disagree with that. Thank you. I don't know. I think we have 1 second left, and I have a track record for being on time in DLD, so I don't want to break that. I don't know whether, Steph, you were able to ask some questions from the audience at all? Or is that opening up a can of worms?
That's probably, from a timing point, not
Okay. Thank you, Paul. That was
My
fascinating.
pleasure.
Thank you
Thank you very
much.
much.